Brandon Chen stood frozen in the doorway of his English classroom, staring at the paper in his hands like it might suddenly burst into flames. The bold red F seemed to pulse on the page, mocking him with every heartbeat that thundered in his ears. He read the grade again, then a third time, certain his eyes were playing tricks on him. But no matter how many times he blinked, that letter remained stark and unforgiving against the white paper. This couldn't be right. It just couldn't be. For 3 years, Mrs. Patricia Holloway had been more than just his English teacher. She'd been his mentor, his advocate, the person who'd spent countless hours after school helping him improve his writing. She'd written his recommendation letters for scholarships, even though he'd ultimately decided the military was his path. She'd never given him anything below a B, and most of the time, his papers came back with A's circled at the top and encouraging notes scribbled in the margins. Brandon's hands trembled slightly as he approached her desk after class. The other students filed out, their voices fading into the hallway's distant chatter. Mrs. Holloway sat there grading papers, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in its usual neat bun, reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked up as his shadow fell across her desk. "Mrs. Holloway," he started, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat, embarrassed. "I think there might be a mistake with my paper." She glanced at the F-marked essay he placed on her desk, then back at him. Her expression was unreadable, almost carefully blank in a way that made his stomach drop. "There's no mistake, Brandon, but I don't understand. I followed the rubric exactly. I cited all my sources properly. I even had my mom proofread it for grammar errors." He could hear the desperation creeping into his voice and hated himself for it. He was 17 years old, practically an adult, 2 weeks away from graduating and starting his life. He shouldn't sound like he was about to cry over a grade. Mrs. Holloway removed her glasses and set them down with deliberate precision. When she looked at him, her eyes were tired in a way he'd never noticed before. "The thesis wasn't strong enough. Your supporting arguments lacked depth. You'll need to rewrite it." Brandon felt his face flush hot. "What? Mrs. Holloway, graduation is in 2 weeks. I need to pass this class to graduate on time. I have to report to basic training 3 weeks from now. My recruiter already has all my paperwork processed. Then I suggest you start rewriting immediately." Her voice was firm, almost cold. She picked up her red pen and turned her attention back to the stack of papers in front of her, effectively dismissing him. He stood there for a long moment, words tumbling through his mind but refusing to form coherent sentences. Finally he managed, "I don't understand what's happening." She didn't look up. "You have until Friday to submit the revision." "That's 3 days." Brandon left the classroom in a daze, the F-marked paper crumpled slightly in his grip. In the hallway, his best friend Theo was waiting by the lockers. One look at Brandon's face told him everything. "Dude, what's wrong? You look like someone died." "Mrs. Holloway failed my final paper." The words came out flat, disbelieving. "What? That's impossible. She loves you. You're like her star student." "I know." Brandon shook his head, still trying to process it. "I have no idea what happened. She said my thesis wasn't strong enough, but Theo, I worked on that paper for 2 weeks. I outlined it, researched it, revised it twice. It was good work. Maybe she's having a bad day? Personal stuff? Maybe. But something in Brandon's gut told him this was different. The way she'd looked at him, or rather, the way she'd deliberately not looked at him, the careful blankness of her expression. It felt wrong in a way he couldn't quite name. That evening, Brandon sat at his kitchen table with his laptop, the original paper pulled up on the screen alongside a blank document. His mother, a nurse who worked night shifts, poured herself coffee before her shift started. "How was school, honey?" "Mrs. Holloway failed my final paper." His mother's hand froze mid-pour. "What, Patricia failed you? That doesn't make any sense." Brandon's parents had met Mrs. Holloway multiple times over the years at parent-teacher conferences, school events, even once at the grocery store where they'd chatted for 20 minutes about Brandon's college options. His mother considered her one of the good ones. A teacher who genuinely cared. "She said I need to rewrite it by Friday. Let me see it." His mother set down the coffee pot and took the paper from his hands, her eyes scanning the pages quickly. She'd been an English major in college before switching to nursing, and she'd proofread countless papers for Brandon over the years. After a few minutes, she looked up, confusion evident on her face. "Brandon, this is solid work. The thesis is clear. Your arguments are well supported. Your evidence is properly cited. I don't understand why she'd fail this. That's what I thought too. I'm calling the school tomorrow. This isn't right. But Brandon spent that night rewriting anyway because what choice did he have? He strengthened his thesis, expanded his arguments, added more evidence. He worked until 2 in the morning, his eyes burning with exhaustion, and submitted the revision early Friday morning. The following Tuesday, he got the paper back. Another F. This time, the comments were even more vague. Argument structure needs improvement. Evidence selection is questionable. Rewrite required. Brandon sat in his car in the school parking lot, the paper on his lap, and felt something crack inside his chest. This wasn't about the quality of his work. It couldn't be. But he had no idea what it was actually about. His mother made good on her promise and called the school. Then she scheduled a meeting with the principal. Brandon's father, who worked construction and rarely took time off, rearranged his schedule to attend. They all sat in Principal Rodriguez's office while Mrs. Holloway explained, with careful documentation and marked rubrics, why Brandon's work didn't meet the standards for passing. I have to maintain academic integrity, she said, her voice steady. Brandon is a good student, but this particular assignment didn't meet the requirements. I can't pass him simply because he has plans after graduation. Brandon's father, usually calm and measured, raised his voice. Patricia, you've taught our son for 3 years. You've praised his writing. You wrote him recommendation letters saying he was one of the best students you'd ever taught. Now suddenly, 2 weeks before graduation, his work isn't good enough? Mrs. Holloway's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. People have bad assignments sometimes. Even good students. 2 bad assignments in a row? His mother interjected. That seems like quite a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. It's simply the reality of the work he submitted. Mrs. Holloway's hands were folded on the table in front of her, and Brandon noticed for the first time how tightly she was gripping them. Knuckles white with tension. The meeting ended with no resolution. Brandon's graduation was officially postponed. He'd have to retake the English assignment during the summer session, which meant his military start date would be delayed. His recruiter was understanding but firm. If Brandon couldn't graduate on schedule, they'd have to push his training start date to the next available slot, which wouldn't be for another 3 months at minimum. Brandon watched his friends graduate without him. He sat in the audience with his parents wearing jeans and a button-down shirt instead of a cap and gown, and felt the weight of humiliation settle over his shoulders like a heavy coat. Theo walked across the stage and gave him a sympathetic look from the podium. Other students whispered, glancing back at where Brandon sat. Everyone knew. Small school, big gossip. The next day, Brandon started summer school. Mrs. Holloway taught the class because of course she did. She assigned him another paper. He wrote it carefully, meticulously, having his mother read every draft. Another F. Different reasons this time, tone issues, and insufficient analysis. 3 weeks into summer school, Brandon noticed something odd. During breaks, Mrs. Holloway would step outside the classroom and make phone calls. Through the window, he could see her pacing, one hand pressed to her forehead, her mouth moving rapidly like she was having intense conversations. Her hands would shake slightly when she came back inside. She looked thinner too, like she wasn't eating properly. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Other teachers started noticing Brandon's situation. Mr. Peterson, his former history teacher, pulled him aside one day. I heard about what's happening with Holloway. I don't get it. She's always been tough but fair. This seems out of character. I have no idea what I did wrong, Brandon admitted. If I knew, I'd fix it. What Brandon didn't know was that during those phone calls, Mrs. Holloway was talking to her husband, a military intelligence analyst who worked in a nondescript office building 40 miles away. And what he definitely didn't know was that she spent every night lying awake, wondering if she was doing the right thing, wondering if destroying this kid's trust in her was worth it, wondering if she'd be able to look at herself in the mirror when this was all over. Part 2. August heat shimmered off the pavement as Brandon walked into the library for another tutoring session that Mrs. Holloway had insisted on. It was his 4th rewrite of what should have been a simple assignment, and by now the whole situation had taken on a surreal quality. He felt like he was trapped in some kind of bizarre loop where nothing he did would ever be good enough. The library was mostly empty, just a few summer school students scattered among the tables. Mrs. Holloway sat in a study room in the back, papers spread out in front of her. When Brandon entered, she looked up and gestured to the chair across from her. "Let's review your latest draft," she said. Brandon sat down and pulled out his laptop, but before he could open it, she slid a piece of paper across the table. It was covered in her red pen marks. Another assignment he'd turned in last week. Another F. "I don't understand," he said, and he was so tired of saying those words. "I addressed every single comment you made on the previous version. I rewrote the entire third section. I added the sources you suggested. The transitions are weak. Your conclusion doesn't effectively synthesize your main points." Her voice was flat, almost mechanical, like she was reading from a script. Brandon looked at her carefully, really looked at her. The woman sitting across from him didn't seem like the same person who'd encouraged him through junior year, when he'd struggled with Shakespeare. Her face was drawn, almost gaunt. Her blouse hung looser than he remembered, and her eyes. There was something in her eyes that looked almost like pain. "Mrs. Holloway," he said quietly, "what's really going on here?" For just a second, something flickered across her face. Fear, grief. But then it was gone, replaced by that careful blankness again. "What's going on is that you need to meet the academic standards for graduation. That's all. No, it's not all. This isn't about my writing. You know it isn't. My mom knows it. Every teacher in this school knows it. So why won't you just tell me what I did wrong?" She stood abruptly, gathering her papers. "You didn't do anything wrong, Brandon. That's not what this is about. Then what is it about? Just keep rewriting. You'll get there eventually." She left the study room quickly, almost fleeing, leaving Brandon sitting there with more questions than answers. His parents were beyond frustrated. His father wanted to hire a lawyer. His mother wanted to transfer Brandon to a different school district for summer school. But the principal explained it wasn't that simple. The credits needed to come from their school for his diploma to be processed properly. They felt helpless, watching their son's future plans dissolve while being unable to do anything to stop it. Meanwhile, Brandon's military recruiter, Sergeant Mills, was calling weekly for updates. "Look, son, I believe you're doing your best, but I've got quotas to meet and training slots to fill. If you can't get this resolved soon, I'm going to have to move on to other candidates. You understand?" Brandon understood. He was being replaced. The future he'd planned so carefully. Basic training, specialized technical training, deployment using his GI, bill benefits for college afterward. All of it was slipping away because of a teacher who wouldn't explain why she was failing him. He started spending his lunch breaks in the counselor's office, talking to Mrs. Chen, who'd known him since freshman year. "Have you considered that maybe Mrs. Holloway is dealing with something personal?" she suggested gently. "Sometimes people act out of character when they're under stress. But why take it out on me?" "I don't know, honey. I wish I did." Brandon also noticed that Mrs. Holloway had started arriving at school earlier and staying later. He'd see her car in the parking lot when he arrived at 7 in the morning for his summer classes. It would still be there when he left at 4 in the afternoon. Once, passing by her classroom window around 5:30, he saw her sitting at her desk, head in her hands, shoulders shaking like she was crying. He almost went in. Almost knocked on the door and asked if she was okay. But the memory of that F and all the ones after it kept his feet moving forward instead. The other teachers were starting to talk. In the faculty lounge during lunch breaks, the whispers circulated. Patricia Holloway, usually so professional and composed, was acting strange. She'd snap at colleagues over minor things. She'd zone out during department meetings. Once, another teacher found her in the bathroom, splashing cold water on her face, muttering something about the right thing and no other choice. Mr. Peterson, who'd been teaching at the school for 20 years and considered Patricia a friend, confronted her one afternoon in her classroom. "Patricia, what's happening with the Chen kid? This isn't like you." She didn't look up from the papers she was grading. "I'm maintaining academic standards. That's my job. We both know that's not what this is. I've seen his work. Hell, I've seen work you've praised from him in previous years. Something's going on. Please leave my classroom, Gary." Her voice was ice cold. "I'm worried about you. We all are. I'm fine. Everything is fine." But her hand trembled as she marked another paper with her red pen, and they both knew she was lying. Brandon tried everything. He stayed up until 3 in the morning perfecting papers. He hired a college student who'd graduated with an English degree to review his work. He checked out every writing guide the library had. He even asked other English teachers to look at his papers anonymously, and they all said the same thing. This was solid, passing work. Some said it was better than that. By late August, Brandon had missed his original military start date by 2 months. His friends who'd graduated on time were off at college, posting photos on social media of their dorm rooms and new classmates. Theo was at State University, texting Brandon about parties and football games. The life Brandon was supposed to be living, basic training, new challenges, proving himself, was happening without him. He started to withdraw. His parents noticed him sleeping more, eating less. He'd always been an upbeat kid, optimistic and driven, but now he moved through his days with a heavy listlessness. His mother found him one evening sitting in the dark in his room, just staring at his wall of achievement, certificates from academic competitions, medals from track meets, his acceptance letter to the delayed enlistment program. "Baby, talk to me," she said, sitting on the edge of his bed. "I just don't understand what I'm supposed to learn from this. If she'd tell me what I did wrong, I could fix it. But she won't. She just keeps failing me without explanation, and I'm starting to think maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I'm actually a terrible student and everyone's been lying to me for 3 years. You know that's not true." "Do I? Because right now I don't know anything anymore." His mother held him while he cried for the first time since he was 12 years old, and she felt a rage toward Patricia Holloway that she'd never felt toward another person. What kind of teacher destroys a student like this? The summer school session was supposed to end in mid-September, but Mrs. Holloway arranged for Brandon to have an extended timeline. "We'll work through October if we need to," she told the principal, who was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the situation, but couldn't find any procedural errors in how she was documenting everything. Principal Rodriguez pulled Brandon aside one day. "Look, I know this is frustrating. Between you and me, I think Patricia is being unreasonably harsh. But technically, she has the authority to grade as she sees fit as long as she's following the rubrics and providing feedback. My hands are tied unless you want to pursue a formal grievance. Would that help?" "Honestly? Probably not. It would take months to process, and you'd still need to pass the class eventually. You might as well keep working with her and hope she comes around." So Brandon kept rewriting, paper after paper after paper. Each one came back with an F and new, increasingly nitpicky criticism. "Your word choice in paragraph 3 is too colloquial. This citation format is slightly off. The font you used isn't quite right. It was death by 1,000 cuts." Sergeant Mills finally called in late September to tell Brandon they couldn't hold his spot any longer. "I'm sorry, son. I really am. You seem like a good kid, but I've got a job to do. If you ever get this mess straightened out, give me a call and we'll see what we can do." Brandon hung up and sat in his car in the school parking lot, feeling like he'd just watched his future drive away. He was supposed to be in uniform right now. He was supposed to be learning discipline and purpose. Instead, he was stuck in this nightmare loop with a teacher who seemed determined to destroy him for reasons he couldn't begin to understand. That afternoon, during another tutoring session, Brandon finally lost his composure. "Why are you doing this to me?" he demanded, his voice louder than he'd intended. "Just tell me the truth. Did I do something to offend you? Did I say something wrong? Because I've apologized for things I don't even remember doing, and nothing changes." Mrs. Holloway's face went pale. For a moment, she looked like she might actually tell him something real. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. Then she stood up quickly, knocking over her coffee cup in the process. The dark liquid spread across the table, soaking into papers. "I have to go," she said, and practically ran from the library. Brandon watched her leave, the spilled coffee dripping onto the floor, and felt something inside him break. Not anger anymore, not confusion. Just a hollow acceptance that he might never understand, and that maybe that was the point. Maybe some things in life didn't make sense, and you just had to survive them. He didn't know that Mrs. Holloway drove home that day barely seeing the road through her tears, her husband's words echoing in her mind. "You have to hold on a little longer. Just a little longer. I can't tell you why, but please trust me. His life depends on it." October arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that usually made Brandon feel hopeful. But sitting in his childhood bedroom on a Wednesday morning, scrolling through his phone while his former classmates posted about midterms and campus life, he felt nothing but emptiness. He'd been out of school for months now. Mrs. Holloway had finally passed him in late September. barely, with a D- that felt more like an insult than an achievement. His diploma had been mailed to him. No ceremony, no celebration. Just a piece of paper that had cost him everything. He'd gotten a job at a local hardware store to fill his days and help his parents with bills. The military option felt tainted now, like something that belonged to a different version of himself. A version that had hope and direction. Sergeant Mills had told him to call back when he was ready, but Brandon couldn't imagine being ready. Every time he thought about it, he thought about Mrs. Holloway and those endless failing grades, and he felt sick. His mother was in the kitchen making breakfast when his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Brandon, it's Theo. Turn on the news. Right now. What? Wait, just do it. Channel 7. Brandon walked into the living room where his father was getting ready for work. Dad, can you turn on Channel 7? The TV flickered to life and Brandon's entire world tilted on its axis. The news anchor's face was grave as she spoke. We're continuing our coverage of yesterday's tragic attack on a military convoy in the Middle East. 7 young soldiers, all recent recruits, were killed when their transport vehicle hit an improvised explosive device. The Department of Defense has released the names of the casualties. Names scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Brandon didn't recognize most of them. But then he saw it, the unit designation. The battalion number. His battalion. The one he was supposed to have joined. His legs gave out. He sat down hard on the couch, his phone still pressed to his ear. Theo's voice sounded distant and tinny. Dude, that was your unit. That was supposed to be you. Brandon's father stood frozen, the coffee mug in his hand forgotten. His mother appeared in the doorway, dish towel in hand, and saw both of their faces. What happened? Those soldiers, Brandon's father said, his voice rough. That's the unit Brandon was supposed to deploy with. The news continued, showing photos of the deceased soldiers. They were so young. Kids, really. One of them had a baby face and freckles that reminded Brandon of a guy from his school. Another one was a woman with a bright smile. Probably someone's daughter, someone's sister. They'd graduated on time. They'd started their training on schedule. They'd done everything right, and now they were dead. Brandon's mother sank into the chair, her hand over her mouth. Oh my God, Brandon, the room spun. Brandon tried to do the math in his head, tried to calculate exactly when he would have deployed if Mrs. Holloway hadn't failed him. The timing was too close. Way too close. If he'd graduated in May like he was supposed to, if he'd started basic training in June, if everything had gone according to plan, he would have been on that convoy. The news anchor continued. The attack occurred during what was described as a routine transport mission. Military officials say the soldiers were being moved to a forward operating base when the incident occurred. An investigation is ongoing, but preliminary reports suggest this was a coordinated ambush. The soldiers had only been in country for approximately 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Brandon's hands started shaking. His father sat down beside him, putting a firm hand on his shoulder. Nobody spoke for a long time. They just watched the news coverage, watched the photos of young faces that would never age, listened to military officials talk about honor and sacrifice and tragedy. Finally, Brandon's mother broke the silence. Her voice was strange, distant. Patricia saved your life. What? Brandon looked at her like she was speaking another language. Mrs. Holloway, she delayed your graduation. She kept you here. If you'd graduated on time. She couldn't finish the sentence. Brandon's phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. Please come see me tomorrow. I need to tell you something. Mrs. Holloway. He stared at the message, his mind reeling. The timing couldn't be a coincidence. It couldn't be. That night, Brandon couldn't sleep. He lay in bed watching shadows move across his ceiling, thinking about those 7 soldiers. He looked them up online, read their obituaries, studied their faces. One of them, Private Jackson Torres, had posted on social media just days before about how excited he was for his first real mission. Finally getting to do what we trained for, he'd written. That post now had thousands of comments, most of them from strangers expressing condolences. Brandon thought about all the times he'd cursed Mrs. Holloway's name. All the nights he'd lain awake angry at her, feeling betrayed and confused. He thought about his parents' fury, the meetings with the principal, the way other teachers had looked at her with judgment and confusion. She'd endured all of it. She'd let everyone think she was being cruel or unfair or losing her mind, and maybe, just maybe, she'd been saving his life. But that raised an impossible question. How could she have known? The next morning, Brandon drove to the school. It was a Thursday, mid-morning, and classes were in session. He signed in at the office, and the secretary gave him a sympathetic look. She'd been there for all the meetings, all the arguments about his grades. She's in her classroom, the secretary said quietly. Room 204. Brandon walked the familiar hallways, past his old locker, past the bulletin board where his name still appeared on the National Honor Society list. It felt like visiting a previous life. He knocked on the door of room 204. Come in. Mrs. Holloway was sitting at her desk, but she looked different than he remembered, smaller somehow, more fragile. When she saw him, she stood up quickly, her hand going to her throat. Brandon, thank you for coming. Please sit down. He sat in one of the student desks, feeling absurdly large in it. She came around and sat in the desk next to him, not across from him like a teacher, but beside him like an equal. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Mrs. Holloway took a deep breath. You saw the news? Yeah, that was your unit. Your battalion. I know. She closed her eyes briefly, and he saw her chin tremble. When she opened them again, there were tears there. I need to tell you something. And I need you to understand that what I'm about to say has to stay between us. I could get my husband in serious trouble. I could get myself in serious trouble. But you deserve to know, Brandon leaned forward. What's going on? And so she told him. About her husband, Robert, who worked as an intelligence analyst at a classified military facility. About how he'd come home in early May, looking sick and scared in a way she'd never seen before. About how he'd told her, breaking every protocol he'd ever sworn to uphold, that he'd seen intelligence reports about a specific battalion being moved to a region where hostile forces were planning coordinated attacks. He couldn't share details. He couldn't show her documents. But he'd told her that if she knew any students planning to join that specific unit, she needed to find a way to delay them. He didn't order me to do it, she said, her voice shaking. He just said. He said he couldn't live with himself knowing that information and doing nothing. And I couldn't either. When I saw your military paperwork in your file, when I saw the battalion number, She wiped at her eyes roughly. I couldn't let you go, Brandon. I couldn't. Brandon felt like he was watching this conversation from outside his body. So you failed me. On purpose, I failed you on purpose. Every single time. I documented everything carefully because I wanted to make sure there was no question about whether your academic record was legitimate. I didn't want anyone to think you'd cheated or that your grades were somehow fraudulent. I needed you to be delayed, but I needed your integrity intact. She laughed bitterly. Not that it matters how well I documented things. Everyone thinks I'm either cruel or crazy. The other teachers think I've lost my mind. The principal thinks I'm going through something personal. Your parents think I'm vindictive. And you... She looked at him directly for the first time. You thought I betrayed you. Brandon's throat felt tight. I didn't understand. How could you? I couldn't tell you. Robert could lose his security clearance at minimum. Probably face criminal charges for sharing classified information. And I could be charged with something too, probably. But more than that, she twisted her hands together. The intelligence was specific, but the timing wasn't exact. We didn't know exactly when something might happen, just that there was elevated risk for that battalion in that region. What if I'd told you and you'd decided to go anyway? What if you'd told someone else and they'd told someone else and suddenly there was panic or an investigation? What if my interference somehow made things worse? So you let me hate you. I let you hate me, she agreed. I let everyone hate me, and I've spent the last 5 months barely sleeping, wondering if I was doing the right thing, wondering if maybe the intelligence was wrong and I was destroying your future for nothing, wondering if you'd ever forgive me or if I even deserved forgiveness. She wiped her eyes again. And then yesterday I saw the news and I realized the timing was almost exact. If you'd graduated on schedule, if everything had gone according to plan, you would have been on that convoy. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of 7 dead soldiers hanging in the air between them. Brandon's voice came out hoarse when he finally spoke. You carried this alone? For 5 months? Mrs. Holloway nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Robert and I talked about it every night. He was terrified he'd made the wrong choice telling me, terrified that someone would find out and his career would be over. but more terrified of staying silent and having your death on his conscience. She laughed shakily. We don't even have kids of our own. But he remembered meeting you at the honors ceremony last year. He remembered me talking about how excited you were to serve. And when he saw that battalion designation in his briefings, he couldn't stay quiet. Brandon thought about all those phone calls he'd seen her making, how her hands had shaken, how she'd looked like she was falling apart. People noticed you were acting strange. I'm sure they did. I was acting strange. I was holding this enormous secret, watching you suffer, watching your parents rage at me, and I couldn't explain. Do you know how many times I almost broke? How many times I wanted to pull you aside and just tell you everything? She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot. There was one day in July when you'd just gotten another failed paper back. I saw you in the parking lot sitting in your car and you were crying. And I thought, I can't do this anymore. I can't keep hurting him. I actually walked out to the parking lot ready to tell you everything. What stopped you? Robert called. There'd been another intelligence briefing, and the threat level had been elevated even more. He begged me to hold on, to trust that the information was good, that I was doing the right thing even if it felt terrible. She turned back to face him, so I went back inside and assigned you another rewrite. Brandon stood and walked to where she was standing. Up close, he could see how much this had cost her. The lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, the gray in her hair that seemed more prominent, the way her shoulders curved inward like she was protecting something fragile inside her chest. I spent months thinking you hated me, he said quietly. I thought I'd done something to offend you, or that you decided I wasn't good enough, or that I was just, I don't know, worthless. Mrs. Holloway's face crumpled. Oh, Brandon, no, God, no. You're one of the best students I've ever taught, one of the best people I've ever known. And that made it so much harder because I was watching you lose faith in yourself and I couldn't stop it without risking your life. My parents wanted to get lawyers involved. I know. Your mother called me some things I probably deserved during that meeting with Principal Rodriguez. She smiled sadly. I couldn't even defend myself. All I could do was stick to the rubrics and the documentation and hope that everyone would just think I was being an unreasonable hard ass. Brandon moved to one of the student desks and sat down, suddenly exhausted. So what happens now? Those soldiers. That could have been me. Should I feel guilty? Should I feel grateful? I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. Mrs. Holloway came and sat beside him again. I don't think there's a supposed to in this situation. 7 families are grieving right now because their kids did everything right and still died. You're alive because I interfered with the natural course of your life. Neither of those things is fair. Did your husband know? About the attack? Did he know it was coming yesterday? No, the intelligence wasn't that specific. They knew there was elevated risk in that region, that certain routes were being targeted, that something was being planned, but they didn't know exactly when or where. Robert didn't even know about the attack until I called him yesterday after seeing the news. She paused. He broke down, started talking about resigning, about how the system failed because they had information but couldn't act on it fast enough, couldn't warn the right people in time. I had to talk him down from doing something that would destroy his career and potentially compromise other operations. This is so much bigger than me, Brandon said, the realization hitting him. Those 7 soldiers. Were there intelligence analysts who knew their battalions too? Did anyone try to save them? I don't know. Robert can't talk about other people's cases, but I suspect he's been living with that question too. How many kids has he seen in briefings that he couldn't warn? How many families has he seen suffer because he had to stay silent? She shook her head. The weight of classified knowledge is something I never fully understood until these past months. Brandon thought about that. About knowing something terrible was going to happen and not being able to stop it. About watching dominoes fall when you knew there was a way to change the outcome but couldn't reach it. Your husband broke the rules for me. He did. He could go to prison for that. He could. And you could too for using the information. Probably. Mrs. Holloway met his eyes steadily. But we'd both make the same choice again. Some rules are worth breaking when a life is on the line. They sat quietly for a moment, and Brandon noticed how empty the classroom felt. The walls were covered with student work, inspirational posters, books lined up on shelves. A normal classroom where a teacher had made an impossible choice and lived with the consequences alone. What are you going to tell people? Brandon asked. Everyone thinks you lost your mind. The other teachers, the administration, my parents. They all think something's wrong with you. I can't tell them the truth, so I guess they'll keep thinking something's wrong with me. She shrugged. I've asked for a transfer to another school district. Too many people asking questions here. Too uncomfortable walking past you in the hallways knowing what I did to you. You saved my life. I destroyed your trust in your mentor and delayed your future plans. You saved my life, Brandon repeated more firmly. Mrs. Holloway, I'm sitting here right now breathing and alive because you made a hard choice. Those 7 soldiers don't get to have this conversation. Their parents don't get to hear their voices again. Whatever I lost, trust, time, dignity, it's nothing compared to what I would have lost. She started crying in earnest then, not bothering to hide it or wipe the tears away. I'm so sorry you had to go through what you went through. I'm so sorry I couldn't tell you. Brandon surprised himself by standing and hugging her. She stiffened for a second, then hugged him back. This woman who'd spent 5 months being his villain, because it was the only way to be his savior. When they separated, Mrs. Holloway pulled herself together, grabbing a tissue from her desk and dabbing at her eyes. I've been selfish asking you here. I needed to tell you the truth, but I've also burdened you with something you can never share. You can't tell your parents. You can't tell your friends. You definitely can't tell anyone connected to the military. I understand. Do you? Because it's going to be hard. Your parents are going to keep being angry at me. Other people are going to talk about how I treated you. And you'll have to stay silent, knowing the truth but unable to share it. Brandon thought about that. He thought about his mother's rage, his father's frustration, his friend's confusion. He thought about carrying this secret the way Mrs. Holloway had carried it. It's a small price to pay for being alive. You're more mature than I was at 17. She smiled sadly. What are you going to do now? About the military? I don't know. Part of me still wants to serve, but part of me feels like I'd be tempting fate, you know? Like I got a second chance and I should do something different with it. Whatever you decide, I know you'll do it well. You're that kind of person. Brandon stood to leave, then paused at the door. Mrs. Holloway? Thank you. For everything. For carrying that weight. For making the hard choice. For letting me hate you so I could live to understand. She nodded, unable to speak. As Brandon walked out of the school building into the October sunshine, he felt different than he had walking in. The anger was gone. The confusion was gone. In its place was something heavier and more complex. Gratitude mixed with grief. Relief mixed with survivor's guilt. Understanding mixed with the weight of an impossible secret. His phone buzzed. His mother, how are you feeling? Do you need to come home? He texted back, I'm okay. Just needed some air. I'll be home soon. But before he drove home, Brandon sat in his car and looked up the 7 soldiers again. He read their names out loud, one by one. Private Jackson Torres, Specialist Mia Rodriguez, Private First Class David Johnson, Corporal Andre Washington, Private Christine O'Brien, Specialist Marcus Lee, Private First Class Jordan Williams. 7 people who'd done everything right and still paid the ultimate price. 7 families whose worlds had shattered. 7 futures that would never unfold. And 1 teacher who'd broken every rule to make sure an 8th name wasn't added to that list. The seasons changed, and Brandon found himself moving through life with a strange kind of double consciousness. On the surface, he was figuring out his next steps, taking community college classes, working at the hardware store, saving money. But underneath, he carried the weight of knowing something most people never had to consider. That someone had loved him enough to let him hate them. His mother remained bitter about Mrs. Holloway for weeks after the news about the convoy attack. I know the timing is convenient for her, she said one evening over dinner. But that doesn't excuse what she put you through. She could have found another way. Brandon bit his tongue, chewing his pot roast and saying nothing. His father was more philosophical. Sometimes things work out in ways we don't understand. Maybe we should just be grateful Brandon's here and stop looking for someone to blame. I'm not looking for someone to blame. I'm just saying that woman made our son's life hell for months. Brandon changed the subject, and they moved on to talking about his younger sister's college applications. But later that night, lying in bed, he thought about how impossible it was to watch someone you loved be angry at a person who'd saved your life. The secret sat in his chest like a stone. He heard through the school grapevine that Mrs. Holloway's transfer had been approved. She'd be teaching at a high school in the next county starting in January. Mr. Peterson mentioned it to Brandon. One day when he stopped by the school to pick up some final transcripts, Patricia's leaving, the history teacher said, shaking his head. 20 years at this school and she's just walking away. Shame what happened with you. I still don't understand it. Life's complicated sometimes, Brandon offered. That's the truth. Well, she's a good teacher. Even if she did go a little overboard with you, the students at her new school are lucky to have her. Brandon wondered if Mrs. Holloway would ever tell her husband's story, or if she'd carry it to her grave. He wondered if Robert Holloway still woke up at night thinking about the classified intelligence he'd shared, the rules he'd broken. Did he read about the 7 soldiers? Did he feel guilty for saving one kid while being unable to save the others? In November, Brandon made a decision. He wouldn't go back to the military. Not that exact path, at least, but he couldn't shake the desire to serve, to do something meaningful. He started researching emergency services, EMT training, firefighting programs, search and rescue, ways to help people that didn't involve deployments to war zones. His mother was relieved. His father was supportive. Sergeant Mills, when Brandon called to officially withdraw his application, was understanding. Sometimes the universe has different plans for us, son. You do what feels right. On a cold December afternoon, Brandon drove to the address he'd found online for Robert Holloway. It was a modest house in a suburban neighborhood, with a well-maintained lawn and Christmas lights already hung along the gutters. Brandon sat in his car for 10 minutes, working up the courage to knock on the door. Robert Holloway answered, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, looking like any other middle-aged dad enjoying his weekend. He was shorter than Brandon expected, with gray hair and glasses. Completely ordinary except for the flash of recognition and fear that crossed his face when he saw who was at his door. Brandon Chen, he said quietly. Mr. Holloway, I'm sorry to show up unannounced. I wanted to, I'm not even sure what I wanted. To say thank you, I guess. Robert looked up and down the street quickly, then stepped back. Come inside, quickly. The house was warm and comfortable, decorated with photos of Robert and Mrs. Holloway at various stages of their lives. Hiking in the mountains, at someone's wedding, standing in front of the Grand Canyon. A normal couple with a normal life except for the enormous secret they'd carried together. Patricia told you. It wasn't a question. After the convoy attack, she couldn't keep carrying it alone. Robert sat heavily on his couch, suddenly looking much older than his years. I've violated so many protocols I've lost count. Every day I go to work wondering if today's the day someone figures it out. Every security briefing, every random audit, I think this is it. Has anyone suspected? No, but that almost makes it worse. The lack of consequences feels like borrowed time. He looked at Brandon directly. I need you to understand something. What I did, what we did, we can't ever do it again. I can't make a habit of sharing classified information because I have feelings about it. That's not how the system works. If everyone did what I did, the entire intelligence apparatus would collapse. I understand. Do you? Because I've spent months trying to reconcile what I did. I saved one kid, you, but I couldn't save 7 others. I had information that might have helped, but I couldn't share it through proper channels because by the time it would have been declassified and disseminated and acted upon, it would have been too late. The system that exists to protect national security also sometimes prevents us from protecting individual lives. Brandon sat in the chair across from him. Mrs. Holloway told me you wanted to resign. I still think about it. But then I think, if I'm not there reading those briefings, who will be? At least I'm someone who cares enough to be tormented by it. The next person might just file reports and go home without thinking about the real people behind the intelligence. He rubbed his face with both hands. I don't know if that's rationalization or truth. Maybe it's both. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Robert said, Patricia's leaving her school because of what we did. She loves teaching there, knows those kids, has friendships with teachers she's worked with for decades, but she couldn't stand the weight of everyone's judgment anymore. I could tell people the truth. I could explain. No, Robert's voice was sharp. You can't. Ever. What I told Patricia was classified at a level that could genuinely compromise ongoing operations if it got out. I could face federal charges. Patricia could face charges. You could even face charges for knowing and not reporting. The secret has to stay a secret. Brandon felt the weight of that settle over him. A secret that had saved his life but cost everyone involved something precious. Trust. Peace. Sleep. The simple comfort of being understood. Does it get easier? Brandon asked. Carrying it? I don't know yet. Ask me in 20 years. Robert stood and walked to his window, looking out at his quiet neighborhood. I keep thinking about those 7 soldiers. I've looked them up, read about them. Private Torres wanted to be a teacher after his service. Specialist Rodriguez was saving money to help her parents retire. They all had futures, and those futures are gone now. He turned back to Brandon. So no, it doesn't feel easier. It feels like I played God and chose wrong. You didn't choose wrong. You just couldn't choose for everyone. Tell that to their families. Brandon didn't have a response to that. There wasn't one. The math of tragedy didn't balance. 7 deaths didn't weigh less because 1 life was saved. His survival didn't erase their loss. Before he left, Brandon shook Robert Holloway's hand. Thank you for what you did. And thank you for living with the weight of what you couldn't do. I know that's not the same as peace, but it matters. Robert nodded, his eyes damp. Take care of yourself, son. Make it mean something. The life you still have. Brandon drove home thinking about meaning and purpose and the impossible choices people made in the shadows. He thought about Mrs. Holloway, probably in her new classroom by now, starting over with students who didn't know her story. He thought about Robert going to work every day with classified knowledge burning in his chest. He thought about 7 families decorating for Christmas with empty chairs at their tables. And he thought about his own chair. Still full, still occupied, still here. Time moved forward the way it always does, indifferent to the weight of secrets. Brandon finished his EMT training and got certified. He started working for a local ambulance service, finding purpose in responding to emergencies, in being the person who showed up when things went wrong. His parents were proud. His sister teased him about the uniform. His friends from high school saw his posts and commented about how good he looked in the photos. Nobody knew the real reason he'd chosen this path. Nobody knew about the teacher who'd saved him, or the intelligence analyst who'd broken the rules. They just saw Brandon Chen, good kid, hard worker, someone who'd figured out his life after a brief detour. On the anniversary of the convoy attack, Brandon drove to the school district where Mrs. Holloway now taught. He didn't go inside, that would have been weird showing up at her workplace. Instead, he left a card at the front office addressed to Patricia Holloway with a simple message inside. Thank you for the lesson I couldn't understand at the time. You taught me that love sometimes looks like cruelty, and sacrifice sometimes looks like betrayal. I hope you're sleeping better now. Brandon, he never heard back, and he didn't expect to. Some gifts aren't meant to be acknowledged. Years passed. Brandon became a paramedic, then a firefighter, then eventually a fire chief. He got married to a woman named Kelly who worked as an ER nurse. They had 2 kids. Life unfolded in the normal, beautiful way it does when you're given the chance to live it. Sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, Brandon would think about the parallel life he didn't live. The one where Mrs. Holloway had passed him on schedule. Where he'd graduated with his friends. Where he'd boarded that convoy. He'd imagine the explosion, the sudden violence, the way everything would have just stopped. And then he'd get up and walk down the hallway of his house looking in on his sleeping children, and feel the impossible gratitude of a man who knew exactly what he'd been spared.